I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to the latest military and political updates, we hear from a colleague of Ukrainian journalist Viktoria Roshchyna, who has reportedly died in Russian captivity. And later from representatives of the British Council to discuss the work of their organisation on the ground in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 11th of October, 2 years and 235 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, CEO of the British Council, Scott McDonald, the British Council's Ukraine Country Director, Colm McGivern, live from Kyiv, and also dialing in from Ukraine, freelance journalist Varenytsia. First, over to Dom, though, for a summary of military developments in the past 24 hours.
So Ukraine's General Staff said yesterday that drone operators from the SBU, that's Ukraine's military intelligence, and colleagues of theirs in their special ops forces, struck an ammunition warehouse at the Kanskaya Air Base in Russia's Odessa Republic. I probably mispronounced that. I'm so sorry. Actually, I don't really care. To Russia. This area is 200 kilometres east and southeast of the Kursk bridge. It's the next oblast beyond Krasnodar in Russia. The air base is said to be home to Su-34 and Su-27 fighters. And this strike comes a day after the SBU and Ukrainian SOF hit the Shahed drone storage facility in nearby Krasnodar, in which it's thought around 400 Shahed drones were stored. Now, Ukrainian outlet Suspilne, quoting sources in Ukrainian intelligence, say there were 57 Russian training and combat aircraft and helicopters at the airfield at the time of the strike. US think tank Institute for the Study of War, quoting Russian sources, they say footage published yesterday purportedly shows Ukrainian drones striking the airfield. No comment either from Russia or Ukraine that I can find yet today. Sticking inside Russia, and Moscow is said to have transferred around 50,000 soldiers from other sectors of the front to Kursk Oblast. This comes from Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky. He was speaking yesterday on national TV, reporting here from the Kyiv Independent. General Syrsky said that redeployment had weakened Russian positions in other areas, and he named Zaporizhia, Kherson and Kramatorsk. He said this, of course, made it easier for us to conduct defensive operations, unquote. Now, that's good and welcome, but I note that he specifically mentioned defensive operations there, nothing about going on the offensive. But if that is the case, and that number, 50,000, is huge, that is very interesting, especially if that's what they've transferred, let alone what Russia's already got in the area from conscripts and the Rosgvardia and the FSB and everything else. Certainly not a lot of change in Kursk Oblast over the recent days. Russia seems to be trying to push in from the west. You've got that main Ukrainian salient based around the town of Sudzha. In that relatively oval or circular shaped ground that they've taken there, Russia is trying to push in from the west. Ukraine also has another lodgement much smaller, a bit further to the west. That still seems to be in position, but not a lot of ground shifting on either side up there. I note, though, that senior US officials told Bloomberg that Ukrainian forces should be able to hold the territory they've seized in Kursk Oblast for several months. Or longer, they say, thanks to a steady flow of supplies to Ukraine and Moscow's focus on eastern Ukraine. Russia is focusing on the east. I'll mention that. I'll come on to that in a moment. But more importantly, or more pertinently, Odessa was hit again yesterday. That continues the recent pattern. You may remember 3 civilian vessels docked in Ukrainian ports across the south of the country, in and around Odessa, across the rest of the south. 3 were hit this week alone. The death toll from the Panama-flagged civilian ship that was hit on Wednesday has increased to 8. This looks like another concerted effort by Russia to try and stop the grain industry, try and stop the grain ships coming out of Odessa and the southern ports. Russia also hit the city of Odessa with a missile yesterday. They struck a 2-storey building, killed 4, including a 16-year-old girl. 10 people injured there, Governor Ole Keeper said. Now, across the country, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts were also hit, causing more deaths and injuries. Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Khmelnytsky, Kyiv, Luhansk and Sumy Oblasts also came under attack, but no casualties reported there. Generally, as I said a moment ago, Russia is prioritising the Donbass and the east. I think it's fairly obvious. A lot of people are commenting on it. I think they're trying to push ahead there, grab what land they can before everything turns to mud, just ahead of the hard winter. Toretsk is featuring highly in the last sort of day or so. This is about 40 km north of Donetsk city, about the same distance east-northeast of Pokrovsk. That's under particular pressure. The city military administration head, Vasil Chenchik, said this morning that Ukraine only controls roughly 40 to 50% of the town. He was speaking on national TV. He said that just over 1,000 people remain in the town from a pre-full-scale invasion figure of roughly 70,000. Now, just the last one for me, Francis. News today that Unilever, the sort of British-owned consumer giant Unilever, has sold its Russian assets to a Russian billionaire businessman known as the Hairspray King for a reported €520 million after the firm has been branded the sponsor of war by a number of campaigners. So London-based Unilever, it owns Marmite, it's welcome to it, Dove and Hellmann's also. It says that it sold its Russian subsidiary to Arnest Group, that's a perfume, cosmetic and household goods manufacturer run by a guy called Alexei Sagal. Now, as our colleague here at the Telegraph, senior business reporter Dan Wolfson says, Mr. Sagal has proved a major beneficiary of Western companies' exodus from Russia. He picked up Heineken's Russian subsidiary for just €1. He's also grabbed hold of other things such as the US aluminium car maker Ball Group, all at hugely discounted prices. Now, I mean, he's been able to do that. Others have been able to do it because his assets now valued at about $1 billion, according to Bloomberg. This has been aided by new laws in Russia on Western assets that force them to be sold at major discount to Russian buyers. However, Unilever stayed there. They stayed in the country. The company has been criticised by activists and campaign groups since the start of the full-scale invasion for continuing to do business in Russia. The company has condemned the invasion, saying it's a brutal and senseless act by the Russian state, but campaigners say it has been effectively sponsoring the war by continuing to manufacture in Russia and contributing taxes to the government, which obviously are partly used in the war effort. Now, Heinz Schumacher, Unilever's chief executive, last year argued that staying in Russia was, in his words, the least bad option for the company. Anyway, Natalia Popovich, who's co-founder of the B4 Ukraine campaign group, said, "We are pleased to finally see Unilever make the right move, even though such a decision comes 2 years too late." Bill Browder, friend of the pod, Sir Bill Browder, now, he commented this morning saying, why couldn't they do this 2.5 years ago? Now, in a press release this morning, Unilever said, "Over the past year, we have been carefully preparing the Unilever Russia business for a potential sale. This work has been very complex and has involved separating IT platforms and supply chains, as well as migrating brands to Cyrillic." Separating IT platforms and Google Translate to Cyrillic. Okay, fine. But they say it's taken them 2 years to pull their business out of Russia. Now, when I saw this, I got on to Unilever's press team here in the UK. I asked if anyone was available to come on the pod today to talk about this. An anonymous Unilever press officer replied saying, quote, "Afraid not, but thank you for reaching out. Have a good weekend." Brilliant comms. I then asked if they'd be prepared to answer questions by email, to which they just directed me to their press release. So that's the news about Unilever. I think it's pretty poor comms by them. Firstly, I was upfront and open about who I was. I was signing on my own name. They didn't even sign a name. Just everything was best regards, the press team. You know, it's not ideal. If they're trying to make it land properly, then they should have the gumption to step up and explain themselves. If their chief exec is going to say that or they're going to put out a press release, they should at least try and have a conversation with the journalist. It just puts my back up. So Unilever have finally acted. Up to you to tell us if you think they've done the right thing, if they could have done it sooner. Separating those IT platforms and shifting all the language to Cyrillic does take at least an afternoon. Anyway, let us know what you think. But I will get off my hobby horse there, Francis, and let you have a go.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for that. We'll just quickly go through the political updates before we can get to our guests. So Zelensky is still in the middle of his whistle-stop European tour, but we're getting the first readouts now of the meetings that took place yesterday. Let's start with the meeting at number 10 Downing Street here in London, where after a brief encounter with Larry the Cat, the chief mouser to the Cabinet Office, President Zelensky met with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the new NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Evidently, the recurring issue of Storm Shadow missiles was on the agenda, with number 10 insisting that no war can be won by a single weapon. That's their phrase, defending its continuing refusal to give Kyiv permission for Storm Shadow missiles to be fired on targets in Russia. Those comments come despite the fact that Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary-General, said that there was no legal reason why Kyiv could not use those weapons. Now, in terms of the statement, so we are not going to get into detail about individual systems or operational decisions, as that would play into the hands of Putin. I mean, one could say that it's a bit late for that, given it's been the cornerstone of Western foreign policy to talk about it since the war began. But anyway, I think rather than this representing some new policy, it should instead be read as them not wanting to discuss Storm Shadows explicitly. Our understanding, of course, is that number 10 would have given the permission were Washington supportive, as the government here was urging Washington to do at the UN. But now that the decision has seemingly been made not to, they no longer want it to be the main discussion point. Now, the Ukraine president also presented the PM with his victory plan and the strategy for defending the country in the coming months. But there have been no further details of that either, though James Rothwell speculated about its contents further on the podcast yesterday for those who missed it, and I would recommend listening if you did. I would posit that the victory plan must be quite vague in terms of the details that are being put forward, just because the possibility of security leaks increases with every government official that Ukrainians share it with. But again, that's just my speculation, though what we do know is that it would appear that it does involve a sort of shopping list of requests, as opposed to being a, here's what we plan to do exactly with them. But as I say, we don't know for certain. Now, Zelensky, after meeting with Keir Starmer and Larry the Cat, hopped over to France and Italy, where he met with Emmanuel Macron and Giorgia Meloni, again sharing details of the proposed victory plan. Meloni said at a press conference afterwards that, quote, the goal of our support is to put Ukraine in the best conditions to set up a negotiating table for peace. Peace, which I've said a number of times, cannot mean surrendering, as many, too many, have suggested in a cowardly manner. Zelensky then added, today we paid special attention to the economic aspect of our victory plan, particularly regarding the special economic opportunities in Ukraine and critical resources that must not fall under Russian control. The pair also announced, as the Kyiv Independent have reported this morning, that the next in the series of Ukraine recovery conferences will take place in Rome in July next year on the 10th and the 11th, 2025. Zelensky will also be meeting with Pope Francis later, who, as we've reported in the past, has not made the most helpful statements for Kyiv since the full-scale invasion. But it'll be interesting to see what readouts, if any, come from that. So no great revelations from this rather hastily put together European tour, not that we expected any, but it is telling that once again Zelensky is going around to European allies seeking to persuade them to do more. As we've said many times on the podcast, even if Washington supported Kyiv past November, it is unlikely to do more than it is doing now, based on our current understanding that it will be Harris or Trump in the White House, meaning that if victory is truly Europe's intention, then Europe itself will be required to do more with or without Washington's support. Now, as for Putin, he is visiting Turkmenistan today at an international forum attended by Central Asian leaders and, crucially, the president of Iran. Now, in Putin's opening remarks at that summit, he said he wants to build a new world order. We've heard that one many times before, with Moscow's international partners. James Kilner, regular on the podcast, of course, has written a piece of really interesting analysis for us on this, which we'll link to in the show notes, saying that it appears to have been arranged very last minute. It may be providing an excuse for Putin and the Iranian president to meet, but under the cover of attending the same summit as other leaders, rather than formally meeting one-on-one, which might be considered too incendiary given the situation at the moment. But there is tension, it should be said, within that close relationship at the moment, with some newspapers in Tehran blaming Putin for abandoning Iran over Gaza and for, quote, maintaining its distance from the crisis. Another newspaper said that it was about time the Kremlin delivered on its promise to send sophisticated S-400 missile defence systems to Iran. So a potentially very interesting meeting, which we should all watch with interest. And just lastly, and I want to bring in here, Viktoria Roshchyna, a Ukrainian journalist held captive by Russia, has died, according to a spokesperson of Ukraine's coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war. We've mentioned Victoria's case before, and the circumstances of her death are still being confirmed as we speak, but she disappeared in August 2023 while reporting in Russian-occupied territory. I understand that you knew Victoria. What's your understanding of what happened? Thank you for joining us.
Yes, I knew Victoria. We were colleagues and we worked together, and also I met her on Donbass after invasion and we had some conversations with her. She was really dedicated to her job and she believed it can make changes for society. So that's why she went for occupied territories. She was firstly detained by Russian FSB in March 2022. She spent more than a week in captivity, but then she was released. After that, she went to occupied territories at least twice, to Novokakhovka in Kherson region in April 2022, and then to several regions, Lugansk region, Donetsk region, in I think it was August, September 2022 also. But that time she crossed through the checkpoints in Zaporizhia. But in 2023, she went through the border of Poland with Russia. More likely, she got to occupied Ukrainian territories and then she was detained by Russian forces. And during next almost more than half of a year, there were no any information about her. Russia did not confirm that she was detained. And only in April, her father got news that Victoria was alive. But there were no information about the place of her detention, the place where she was. And many colleagues, Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian lawyers, Ukrainian NGOs mostly were involved in process of searching Victoria. Russia did not give any information about her. There were no possibility to check what was her condition. The only one thing that Ukrainian journalists and NGO found out 2 weeks ago that she was in Russian prison in Taganrog, where there were the worst conditions for Ukrainian prisoners of war, according to the information of those prisoners of war who were released from this prison. And Victoria's father has got letter yesterday from Russian Ministry of Defense that Victoria died on September 19, and no information about how it happened, and no information how, when the body will be given to her relatives.
Well, thank you very much for that, Inna. And what's the reaction been in the Ukrainian press to this announcement?
Everybody is shocked among colleagues. Colleagues are trying to tell more about Victoria as a high-level professional whom she was, and to remind her reports and documentary that she did. She was very young. She was just 27. She should turn 28 on October 6th. And Ukrainian journalistic society is very angry with that fact that none of organizations, NGO like Red Cross or OSCE, they didn't get to Victoria. They didn't get to other Ukrainian journalists who are in Russian jail. And there is a list of many. It's about 328 persons. 28 Ukrainian journalists are still in Russian jail. there is no information about, only if there is just some information about a few of them, but mostly no information about their conditions, about their health, no possibility to write to them. And we know that the list is a bit longer. It's 4 more persons, but their names are not public. And Ukrainian media organizations, they insist on access to Ukrainian journalists who are detained in Russia. They insist on that fact that they should be released, and that's how they react. And as for Victoria, also, we know that there was a long process of letting her of releasing Victoria, and she should be released. She was in process of preparation to release her, but we do not know what's happened to her in jail. What was the attitude to her? We do not know if she was beaten or not. We do not know if she had food and so on, and we do not know why she died. And we have the same, as a journalistic society, we have the same thoughts about another journalists who are prisoners of the war. For example, like Dmytro, who was not confirmed by Russia during last 2 years, once she disappeared in Kyiv region in 2022. But just more than months ago, one of liberated prisoners of war confirmed that Dmytro is alive. And after that, Ukraine officials and NGO are trying to push to help to release him.
Thank you, Ina. And just one final question from us. Describe Victoria. What was she like?
She was really dedicated to her job. So she paid attention to people around her. She could write me asking what I felt or if I was okay, but she almost never talked about herself. Only once, when I met her in late 2022, she said me that she felt scary in Bakhmut. It was just before the final battle for Bakhmut started, and she left Bakhmut. And I think it was only once when she said about her feeling, but mostly she was about people around her. She wanted to help, but she also wanted to stay objective, and she did. That's helped her to report from occupied territories, but at the same time, she was Ukrainian, and because of this, it was too dangerous for her to go to occupied territories. She was very talented. She mostly worked on justice topics. She also started to report about the war since Russian invasion happened. And she never thought about herself.
Well, thank you, Ina, for that context. And we, of course, send our condolences to you and all those in Ukraine who knew Victoria, and indeed to Ukrainian journalists who, of course, will feel her loss. Now on to our next segment. This is going to be very interesting, I think. So I want to welcome onto the podcast Scott and Colm. Thank you both very much for your time. Scott is the head of the British Council, its CEO, and Colm is its Ukraine lead. Now, Scott, you wrote to the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago now, and in that letter you said that a critical aspect of this war is its daily and long-term impact on the Ukrainian people, their cultural sector, education and way of life, and that the British Council is committed to continuing that partnership. And I just wanted to ask you, first of all, about the work of the British Council and other international council bodies that are operating in Ukraine, because it's an aspect of this war that tends to be overlooked compared to, say, the military aspects. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Francis, for having me on the pod today. And I did want to thank you as well just for the work you do, keeping us all up to date on what's happening in Ukraine and the support you provide there. We find it very powerful. And maybe finally, my condolences for the untimely death of your extraordinary colleague, David, who we will miss as well. So I run the British Council, and I'm joined by my colleague, Colm McGivern, who's our country head in Ukraine and is calling in from Kyiv today. So we'll get a chance to hear about what's actually happening on the ground. But the British Council is one of the UK's biggest charities. It's an arm's length body of the UK government. And our focus is on supporting peace and prosperity between people in the UK and around the world. So for 90 years, we've been working to create the conditions that reduce the chances of conflict in the first place, supporting people and institutions impacted during conflicts, and helping to rebuild trust after conflicts. We've been in Ukraine for 30 years. We have about 100 people on the ground supporting Ukraine during the conflict, working towards victory in the war. And the three broad things we do in Ukraine, number one is we focus on arts and culture and really work to bolster Ukrainian cultural identity and morale through this period, both of which are under attack and threat from Russia and need bolstering both in Ukraine and outside. The second area we work on is education. And at its core there, we're working to keep the schools and universities operational and functioning so that education can continue and Ukraine doesn't suffer a huge gap from a lack of multiple years of education. And the third area we work in is on English language teaching, where we support Ukrainians learning English across the country so they can engage effectively and collaborate with other parts of the world, particularly right now, but hopefully also in the future.
Thank you for that overview. Colm, what's your current state in Kyiv and what's the projects that you're prioritising?
Thanks very much, Francis, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, I mean, it's humbling and invigorating to be here at the moment in Kyiv because colleagues are suffering under the most extraordinary conditions and have been for several years. And right up until last night, people in Kyiv would have been up all night and thinking about their families and thinking about the next steps and so on. But it's also invigorating because despite the fact that people are living and working under these conditions, the colleagues here, they don't just turn up for work, they turn it up. They come in every day and they're asking what more can we do in order to forge even stronger connections between the UK and Ukraine in education and culture, and how can we do bigger projects? How can we do more to help English language roll out across the country? How can we help professionalise the university sectors, and what sharing and learning can we have between those sectors? So it's really very, very invigorating, and it's an honour to be here actually and to hold this job at the moment.
Thank you. And so when you look in the abstract at the state of the support that international bodies like the British Council have provided to Ukraine, do you think that there is enough attention given to its importance? Because as I say, it does tend to be missed in some of the conversations that take place, particularly from politicians, about the work that those countries are doing in country, as it were.
Yeah, there's a brilliant quote from Olena Zelenska, the First Lady, where she said that art and culture will not save us from bombs and bullets, but it will save our conscience, our humanity and our values. And I think that sums it up really, really neatly. Everyone that I meet, I was meeting with the Deputy Minister of Culture yesterday, and lots of people that we meet, they say that its culture is under attack in Ukraine as much as the physical infrastructure, etc. And they're exactly right. It's an attempt by the Russians to eradicate an entire culture, and there must be a fight back. The fight back in cultural terms takes an extraordinary amount of resource, and it would have to go into the billions of pounds that are needed in other places at the front line. So I don't think we can ever do enough in order to try and help Ukraine assert its cultural identity on the world stage, but we do all that we can. And I think that's where we and the partners that we work with in education and in culture have to try and link arms, pool our resources and do as much as we possibly can. I mean, we work with a great organisation in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Institute. They're like an analogue organisation for us. Their job is to present Ukraine's cultural identity in the world stage. And they do it brilliantly. And we do all that we can to try and showcase Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian creativity in the UK. We had a major season of culture in 2022, just as the full-scale invasion took place. We did hundreds of projects across the UK, which many of your listeners will have bumped into, I hope, at book festivals and at occasions as they went through the year, as Ukraine was right in the forefront of people's minds. But since then, we've been able to maintain a steady beat of insistent presentation of Ukrainian cultural brilliance in the UK. And I think that's what it takes, actually. It's about being persistent and insistent in making sure that Ukraine's cultural voice is heard in other countries, and particularly for us in the UK.
Thank you. And Scott, if I could just ask you a related question, really, which is, What are the long-term commitments that you think Britain and other countries are going to need to make to Ukraine once this war ends? And indeed, there is no end in sight yet. But this is a generational project, is it not?
I mean, Colm touched on this already. It's hard to underestimate the investment that will be required to rebuild physically, but spiritually for Ukraine. And if I focus in on just the areas we know well, I mean, education is a great example of what happens during a war and how much time you can lose and how you can lose a whole generation of educated people that are actually focused on the right things and skilled in the right areas. One of the really interesting projects we've been running that inspires me in Ukraine it's called Teaching and Learning in Difficult Times. And we have done a teacher training program to help teachers understand that when you have classes where many of the children in the classes, often their fathers will be certainly gone, missing, possibly dead, and there's enormous chaos in their lives. They're sleeping in bomb shelters many nights, and there's lots of movement and things going on. How do you actually teach in this environment so the kids don't just lose 3 or 4 years of their education? And it requires all sorts of different skills and techniques and physical things in the schools. And so that program we're trying to run for about 15,000 teachers across the country. I was there in March and visited one of the schools that you may have even covered before on the podcast, where they have entirely underneath the school, there is a bomb shelter set up so that when the sirens go off, all the kids can just go downstairs into these classes and continue and not lose time and not lose education. But now they've also got the teachers trained up to be attentive to things that you just wouldn't normally learn as a normal teacher.
Scott, Colm, hi, it's Dom here. Thank you very much for joining us today. If I could take a little step back and look at the work you do more broadly. You say British Council has an arm's length relationship with the British government. I'm interested in how long that arm is and where your work or the work of the Foreign Office, for example, might end and your work starts. So if you're able to describe that relationship, I'd be interested. But specifically, does the British Council still have any footprint or work in Russia and in Belarus? Do we still have any of these contacts ongoing?
The first question on how long is the arm. So when we were set up, the idea of the British Council would be that we could think longer term than governments. So we didn't have to flip positions every 3 or 4 or 8 years as government changes. And we could take this approach to building trust and working with other countries where they wouldn't think we were completely tied with our government. But having said that, we're incredibly aligned with the government. We work closely with them. We work very closely with the FCDO, the Foreign Office. And we work with the embassies and high commissions around the world. And Ukraine is a good example where we will work every day with the British embassy there and collaborate in all of the things we have talked about. So it's a pretty close relationship. The second part of your question is other countries. And so our goal is to try and continue working everywhere to keep the strongest people-to-people relationships we can, despite government relationships and despite the conflicts that might be going on. Occasionally, it proves impossible to do that because a government is so extreme and the situation is so extreme. And Russia is a case of that, where we no longer have operations on the ground in Russia, and we don't have any in Belarus either.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I genuinely wasn't aware if you did. I mean, what would be the conditions, do you think, for the British Council re-engaging in Russia? Is it as black and white as Putin's not there, or under what kind of conditions have you gone back into other areas? For example, did you have something similar with the sort of Belgrade authorities, for example, in the late 90s? And have you got any examples you can point us to for where you have re-engaged post-conflict or a breakdown in diplomatic ties?
Yeah. So as I said, our goal is to always re-engage because we're pretty confident there's a group of people in Russia as well who share our values and probably share our view on the world and would like to re-engage at one point. But we could only do that when it was safe for our people to do so and where there was some alignment with the regime there that we could trust on the values side. So there are places in the world like Iran that we have pulled out of, which we have never been able to go back into. But there are spots, for instance, in the Middle East where we find Yemen would be an example. We can continue to operate in Yemen and do many of the things we do despite the regime there. We can continue to operate in a place like Iraq similarly. So it is very possible, but the hostility from the Russian government and the current position makes it impossible for now.
Understood. Thank you. And just finally from me, how supported are you by successive British governments? Is your budget ring-fenced, for example? Has it gone up or down over the last few years? And I note the context of the cutbacks to the BBC World Service. I just wonder what your view was on, I can't think of any other way. It's too easy a term to start reaching for hard power, soft power. And I know that doesn't even touch the sides of the issues we're dealing with. But in terms of the cutbacks to something like the BBC World Service, how detrimental was that to the export of British values and culture generally?
So I think we've always had a volatile relationship with government for the 90 years we've been around because we're slightly independent. And I can understand no government ever really likes to have an arm that they can't fully control. But then they constantly remind themselves too, that's why we actually created the British Council, and that the purpose of that is to give us this longer term view. So ultimately we have friction and we are generally supported by the government. I think it's fair to say that the government now in power in the UK for the last 3 months has been more enthusiastic about soft power in general, and certainly warmer in their rhetoric around soft power and its role and the types of things we do, as they haven't arrived with a whole lot of financial power as they've come into the government. So we've yet to see exactly how that will play out.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Colm, for your thoughts on that. I've got a couple more questions, if I may. Scott, this may make sense, first of all, to you, but then I do have some more specific ones on the ground in Ukraine. What is the nature of other international bodies? Is this quite a unique British institution, as it were, or are you working also in partnership with other similar entities that are seeking to do work in Ukraine and other countries? Or is this something that actually has a much longer history here in the UK?
So several countries have something similar to the British Council. Germany has the Goethe Institute, the Institut Français in France, there's a Cervantes Institute in Spain, and they are all funded partly by the government like we are. Because the British Council is so much bigger, because we have so much funding outside the government as well, we tend to pack an enormous punch around the world, and historically that's been the case for us. To some extent that's declining because our competitors around the world, like the Confucius Institute in China, are becoming enormously well-funded and large, so that's something we need to work on. But the ones that we work most closely with are probably the European ones, and we do collaborative work with them almost everywhere, including in Ukraine.
Thank you. And just staying on the Confucius Institutes and entities like those, have you noticed the deliberate increase of their presence in places that perhaps they formerly were not as present? I'm thinking particularly in Africa. I'm very interested in your perspective on those institutes and the work that they're doing and perhaps the thinking behind them.
To some extent, the thinking behind them is the same as the thinking behind the British Council. They are trying to get out and share their view of the world and their values around the world. I think they work slightly differently than us because China has a more linked up policy overall, whether it's government, Confucius Institute, or other parts. In the UK, we collaborate, we're aligned, but we still operate more independently of each other.
Thank you. And Colm, just want to bring you in here on some more specific projects. You mentioned the school underground, and actually one of David's interviews and projects that he was working on that we released a few weeks ago was going down into one of those schools. I wonder if you can just give a few more tangible examples of the kind of work that you are doing, and perhaps some examples that will be lesser known to even informed audiences on the matter of Ukraine and the kind of work that's being done there.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. And, I remember that episode as well. And just to say, I really appreciate the fact that you're releasing David's last podcasts because they're all golden, So thank you for doing that. I've visited schools. I've worked with these teachers. Today, we are training teachers in how to help understand when children are presenting themselves with an experience of trauma, and what are the techniques that they can use to help them engage those children in a more inclusive way in classrooms. And remember, this is the generation that's gone through COVID as well as the full-scale invasion, so it's a particularly difficult time in education in the country. But as I was saying earlier on, there's a really good story for the UK to stand proud over in relation to higher education. And I think the links and relationships that were forged from 2022 in the University Twinning programme that was run by Universities UK and Cormac Consulting, it's a brilliant story for the UK. And we work alongside that programme, providing leadership development, training and learning and sharing between UK and Ukrainian institutions to try and strengthen the Ukrainian higher education sector. And those combined initiatives mean that the UK is making a major contribution to the future of higher education in Ukraine and learning a lot as a result. But just a couple of smaller things that, that we have as part of the steady beat of connection between our countries culturally. There's 3 Ukrainian animators who are going to be in Manchester very, very soon as part of Manchester Animation Festival. There they'll be pitching their ideas that may be commissioned as part of the UK Animation Lab. We've just had 3 Ukrainian poets at Monarchmore, the Scotland's Creative Writing Centre, which many of your listeners will know and love. And they were there on residency. And I'm sure the sharing that they had with the leaders of Monarchmore would have been absolutely extraordinary. And you'll see Ukrainian films at Leeds International Film Festival and at Brighton and in Cornwall. There'll be Ukrainian delegates who will go to the Association of British Orchestras conference and to WOMEX. And just to double click on the creative industries here in Ukraine, we're really proud of our history of having supported the development of the creative industries in Ukraine over many, many years. We've many alumni of our training programs, and some of them are going to the Beyond conference for the creative industries in the UK. The creative industries are going to be a real dynamo in the future rebuilding and redevelopment of Ukraine. And the final thing I'll say, Francis, if I can, is that it's a big development for us, as I'm sure you and your listeners will understand. But very soon, we hope to be able to welcome UK artists back to Ukraine for the first time under the British Council's auspices since 2022. We've got a grant scheme open for applications at the moment. We can give you the link for the show notes. But it would be just wonderful to see UK artists and creatives in Ukraine collaborating with their Ukrainian counterparts once again, because it adds so much more resonance to the relationship, and it would just be absolutely brilliant to see that. So we're really proud of the fact we've been able to manage that, and we're looking forward to welcoming and giving a great big Kyivian hug to the artists when they get here.
Well, thank you both very much for your time. We'll go to final thoughts next, but just a question perhaps as part of your final thoughts that I put to you both, which is what you've learnt from Ukraine and the work that you've done in Ukraine and Ukrainians over this period that you've been operating there, whether it be 30 years and post the full-scale invasion. Just be interested in that interplay and exchange of ideas, because it has been very noteworthy, and one of you alluded to it earlier on, that we have learnt so much more about Ukraine than we ever knew prior to the full-scale invasion. And we obviously wish that the invasion had never happened, but it has shown the world so much more about Ukrainian culture and way of life. And if there is any light to be found amid so much darkness, it is that. But we'll go to final thoughts now. Dom, I'm going to go to you last. So perhaps, Scott, you could start us off.
Thanks, Francis. Maybe I'll focus right in on your question and just say, the thing I've been reminded of with my association with Ukraine, and particularly with my visit this year, is about resilience and how amazing our team is there, but how amazing the whole country has been. So when I went in March, the first night I was there was a very severe bombing raid, and the entire country and Kyiv was all in lockdown. So Colm and I actually spent the night in a bomb shelter. And then we got up the next morning, or took our coffee the next morning after sitting up all night, and went out to join our program that day, which was about 10 or 12 meetings starting at 8 a.m. And no one in the city lost a beat. So everyone seemed to come straight from the bomb shelters to starting work. We arrived at the school, everyone was there, all the kids were there, all the teachers were there. The country didn't even blink. And I went home unbelievably with incredible admiration for the people of Ukraine and for my colleagues who just do the most amazing things.
Thank you, Scott. Colm, over to you.
Thanks, Francis. Well, just, very briefly, I've had a realization here the more and more I work with people that there's a great deal of similarity between some of my own personal experiences and what I see here. And that's that in a war like this, colleagues don't want it to be forgotten, would like it to be acknowledged, but do not want to be defined by that one single narrative. And they want the world to remember that their arts and culture is strong and brilliant in its own right, that their educational system deserves to be the best and world class, and that young people need to have a broader future rather than just being defined as coming from a conflict zone.
Thank you both very much for your time. Dom, you've got the final thoughts for the week.
Well, thanks, Francis. And Colm, Scott, thank you so much for coming on today. Please do stay in touch with us, guys. We're very keen to keep in touch with your work and maybe go out and visit some of the projects that you've spoken about. So please do keep us in mind. So, folks, Monday, Tuesday this week, as I said a couple of days ago, David was laid to rest on Islay, the Scottish island of Islay. There was a prayer service at the Kildalton Cross on Monday, and then on Tuesday, after another service, the family followed the hearse alongside the bay in Port Ellen to the sound of bagpipes before David was buried in the nearby cemetery. Adderley made a recording with which we will play out the podcast today. Please don't worry about the sound quality. It's outside, it's on a phone, as much of what we do is. You can hear the footsteps of the family as they accompany David, and the lovely sound of the bagpipes as he was laid to rest. So we'll see you all again next week. And once again, thanks for your company.